to host today one of our keynote speakers, Dr. Geoffrey Mankoff, who is currently Deputy Director and Fellow in the Russia-Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who's going to be talking to us on the topic of Russia and China in the U.S. pilot to aid. Let me give you just a little bit of background information, Dr. Geoffrey Mankoff. So before becoming a deputy director at the CSIS, the Russian Eurasia program, he was a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow based in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs in the U.S. Department of State. And before that, from 2008 to 2010, Dr. Mankoff was Associate Director of International Security Studies at Yale University, and also Adjunct Fellow for Russia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And previously, he held many other positions, such as the John Howling National areas of expertise, which include Russian Eurasian affairs, great power relations, foreign policy decision-making, ethnic conflict, and energy security. Dr. Mankoff also teaches courses in international security, Russian and Central Asian affairs, and modern diplomatic and military history. He earned his PhD and Master's of Philosophy in Diplomatic History, as well as his MA in Political Science from Yale University. And he earned his BA, Bachelor's degree in International Studies and Russian from the University of Oklahoma. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Geoffrey.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you all for being here. I have the unenviable position of being all but standing between you guys and lunch. Fit into the overall U.S. strategic pivot to Asia, which is now, over the course of the last couple of years, really the biggest long-term development, I think, in the unfolding U.S. foreign policy. In the United States, this strategic shift to Asia is driven by, in the first instance, Asia's across much of Asia threatens this long-term growth, which could have serious impacts not so engaged in calling it a pivot to Asia might be too strong, but at least refocusing in some ways on developments in Asia. And I think understanding the basis for this shift and its implications for regional economics and security is quite important for the United States as it thinks about its own strategy in Asia. Now, the Russian pivot or shift to Asia is, I think, much There are a number of reasons why politicians, analysts in Moscow and in the Asian parts of Russia are really focusing more on this part of the world now relative to a couple of years ago. One simply has to do with economic interests. The least economically developed, most troubled part of the Russian Federation is, as we probably all know, the East Siberia and the Far East. And there's a growing sense that the region's economic and political salvation lies in both to assert a sort of centralized control over this process of economic integration between the Russian Far East and the dynamic economies of Asia. There's a sense of fear, really, that you get from people both in Moscow and in the Far East, that if this transition is not handled well, you could see a situation in which Siberia and the Far East are increasingly oriented towards Asia rather than towards Moscow. And this could have consequences that are serious not only at the economic level, but politically and geopolitically. position vis-a-vis the rise of China and how that fits in with what has been for a long time the dominant piece of Russia's international security strategy, which has been figuring out how to manage relations with Washington. There's certainly an emphasis on reducing the Western centrism of the international model, of finding a partner that allows Russia to have a more balanced relationship with the United States, and one that shares a lot of key political values that are at the heart of the Russian political system. For example, the notion of a multipolar international. These rhetorical emphasis on Asia that has been coming out of policy journals, official pronouncements, and the like in Russia over the last couple of years. One of the things that's really striking in the United States, and I as the Union as a state whose primary importance for U.S. foreign policy resides in Europe and let's call it the greater Middle East, as it was defined earlier, the Caucasus, the Middle East, Central Asia, the post-Soviet world. In Hillary Rodham Clinton's notable article in Foreign Policy, where she really laid out the underlying strategic thinking behind the U.S. pivot to Asia, Russia wasn't even mentioned. In a lot of the defense, in one of the major defense white papers that was released shortly thereafter, talking about U.S. defense strategy in Asia, Russia wasn't mentioned. And I think that ignoring or overlooking the significance of Russia as a potential actor in Asia and the Pacific on the part of the United States is engagement remains heavily focused on Europe and the post-Soviet space. However, given geography and given what developments in Russian politics, I think there's a potential for some fairly important changes in that regard. And if we're thinking about the U.S. pivot to Asia as being a strategy for a couple of decades rather than a couple of years, certainly it is worthwhile to think about the role that Russia can play. Now, if the U.S. strategy of pivoting to Asia is not about Russia and doesn't really take Russia into consideration, what it is really about is China. And yet, I'd say there's a kind of tension within the U.S. pivot strategy right now, a kind of tension between trying to engage China in order to make it, as former Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick called it, a responsible stakeholder in the liberal international order, and more specifically, the regional order in Asia, and trying to contain China, keeping China bottled up so that it doesn't pose a threat to stability and security as it's existed on the basis of the sort of hub and spokes model of bilateral alliances that the U.S. has presided over really since the end of the Second World War. Because Russia is not really a pillar of that system, it's a moment where there's a lot of dynamism, a lot of flexibility, and I would argue for the United States, an opportunity to shape Russia's engagement with the Asia-Pacific in ways that are coincident with long-term U.S. national interests. Now, if the underlying logic of the U.S. pivot is creating conditions to ensure that China's rise takes place with minimal disruption to the existing international order, then the U.S. has a strong interest in having Russia also be a pillar of that order to which it's pivoting. Now, this is hard because we don't know exactly how Russia itself is going to evolve, how Russian views of Asia and of China specifically are going to evolve in the years ahead. As we've heard from some of the previous panelists, there is also a fundamental tension within Russia about the reasons for getting involved in Asia, and more specifically about the views of China. On the one hand, as Bobo Lo and others have argued, the pivot, Russia's quote-unquote pivot to Asia, is really kind of a pivot to China. It's a way to seek ballast against the United States. It's a way of bolstering Russia's claim to have global standing despite its weaknesses in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that it's really driven by this sense of searching for a partner that will allow Russia to punch above its weight internationally. Increasingly, though, you hear Russians talking about the importance of Asia as a driver for the economic development of the Russian Far East and Eastern Siberia. And if that's the case, obviously China plays an important role, but at the same time, China is something of a threat because, as we just heard, there's a very large imbalance in terms not only of the population, but in terms of economic development, in terms of investment potential between the Russian Far East and China's, including Northwest China. And so in some ways, there's this fear that if you become overly dependent on China as the source of modernization for the Far East, you're going to be exacerbating the very problem you're trying to prevent, which is the split of the Far East in at least economic terms away from Moscow, the kind of loosening of central control over this region as it drifts closer and closer into the Chinese orbit. So, as we know, Russo-Chinese relations have evolved significantly over the course of the 2 decades since the Soviet collapse. Xi Jinping was just in Moscow. A number of deals were signed on banking, energy. Rosneft agreed to triple its supplies to China in exchange for a $30 billion loan and to finance its purchase of TNK-BP, which says something about this relative prioritization of China and of Chinese and Western partners in the development of Russian energy. CNPC, the China National Petroleum Company, was also given the right to explore in the Russian Arctic, something that Western energy companies have been seeking to do with very limited success for some time. And when Xi was in Moscow, he made his keynote address at Moscow State Institute for International Relations and was keen to emphasize the common values underpinning Russia's and China's engagement with the world. And these are specifically the things I talked about before. The importance of state sovereignty, the importance of international law as defined by the United Nations Security Council, non-interference in other countries' international affairs. Basically, international values at odds with the way we in the West are accustomed to thinking. It's interesting, too, and I point this out sometimes, that when Dmitry Medvedev became president of Russia in 2009, his first foreign visit also took him to China, in addition to Central Asia. So, in some ways, Xi's visit to Moscow is a kind of repayment for that. Now, this warming in Sino-Russian relations is a relatively recent trend. For much of the Cold War, that relationship was quite bad. Going back to the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, Stalin supporting a coalition between the Kuomintang and the Chinese communists, wariness about Mao's seizure of power in 1949, then the denunciation of Stalin by Khrushchev at a moment when Stalin was being built up as a model for the political development of communist China in the mid-1950s, all of this culminating with serious border clashes on Damansky Island in 1969. So for much of the Cold War, this was a very difficult relationship. And certainly it was the difficulties in this relationship that allowed for President Nixon to go to China, that allowed for the opening between the U.S. and the People's Republic as a way of balancing against Soviet power. And this tension between Moscow and Beijing really continued up until the very last days of the Cold War. Gorbachev finally visited China in 1989. And that was the moment, really, when you can date the rapprochement, the warming of relations between the two countries. During the 1990s, the relationship warmed very, very quickly. The key was border demarcation. This was a process that took place over the course of several years, very complicated negotiations about finally settling the frontier amid Chinese concerns or amid Russian concerns that China would have irredentist claims on those areas of Siberia and the Far East that were claimed from a weakened Qing dynasty in the middle of the 19th century. It was only in 2004 that the last disputes over the Sino-Russian border were finalized. In addition, the rapprochement between Beijing and Moscow paved the way for growing coordination, if not open cooperation at the UN Security Council for the growth of arms sales and for the deepening economic partnership between the two countries. To the point where, until about a year ago, China had displaced Germany to become Russia's #1 source of foreign trade. Though, of course, with the caveat that most of Russia's exports to China are energy sales, and most of Russia's imports are technical and consumer goods. So, in a way, feeding again these concerns about the reorientation of the Russian economy, about Russia becoming a natural resource appendage of China. There's been increasing military cooperation as well, both bilaterally and in the context of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The SCO now hosts the annual peace mission exercises, which have taken place at different points in Russia, in China, to deal with shared threats, usually something connected with terrorism or drug trafficking. Last year, there were bilateral naval exercises in the Yellow Sea, and the question of arms sales, which the previous panelists discussed, again, starting to take off after diminishing quite significantly in the middle of the last. Now, I would argue that this improved Sino-Russian relationship is actually beneficial for the region as a whole. It opens the way for increased energy diversification. It reduces political fragmentation and the likelihood of conflict breaking out in the region. However, there are some longer-term dangers, especially from the perspective of the United States. The biggest concern that people in Washington talk about a lot is the potential for the coalescence of some kind of Sino-Russian political bloc, whether you want to call it an alliance, strategic alignment, or whatever else, but essentially a revisionist bloc keen on challenging the liberal economic order and the alliance-based security structure that exists in Asia, with the United States at the center. Now, I would argue that the odds of this happening are actually relatively low. One of the few things that could actually help bring it about are massive strategic mistakes on the part of the United States, actively alienating both Russia and China in the course of its pivot to Asia, and I hope that we won't do that. That said, the Sino-Russian relationship does have a lot of tension points in it, and I think these are worth keeping in mind as people worry about the potential for Sino-Russian cooperation against the United States or against the existing international order in the region. I just want to talk about three of these. One has to do with the Russian Far East itself. In the mid-90s and into the 2000s, the big fear here was immigration, the kind of yellow peril, that there are going to be massive numbers of Chinese migrants flowing over the border into these relatively unpopulated towns on the Russian side of the border, and that this would eventually lay the foundation for kind of creeping annexation of at least the border areas, if not Siberia and the Far East as a whole. This fear has actually not been borne out. In fact, Harley Balzer at Georgetown University, who's done probably the best study on this, has noted that if anything, the migrant flows seem to be going more the other direction, as you have Russians who realize that there are better economic opportunities on the Chinese side of the border moving there rather than Chinese moving into Russia. Nevertheless, the diverging paths of economic development on either side of the border do raise serious concerns both in Siberia and the Far East and in Moscow about the loosening of the strings tying these far-flung regions to the center of the Russian state. The gradual loss of Russia's ability to project power in this region. So even if it remains formally tied to Moscow, Russia's inability to use it as a military, as a security base for operations in Central Asia or in Asia more broadly because of Chinese opposition. And this is a fear that Karaganov, I think, is the first one to characterize it with the term Finlandization, but a more credit the place where companies are But because of the way that the Russian budgeting system works, in some ways this doesn't matter because the revenues are being transferred out of the regions to the center. In 2006, Putin declared that the underdevelopment of the Russian Far East was a threat to Russia's national security. And since then, there's been a growing emphasis on figuring out how to take advantage of not only the natural resources in the region, but also its strategic location in Asia as a crossroads between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe to bring about long-term development. Recently, a new Ministry of Far Eastern Development was created. Detailed plans have been released by the Kremlin for economic development of both the Far East and Siberia. And just a couple of days ago, the Kremlin announced new infrastructure investment for the region amounting to 3.8 trillion rubles, as well as significant tax cuts to try and kickstart growth in the region. Of course, given the problems of governance in the Russian Far East, this is kind of akin to throwing money down a black hole, a point that the finance ministry in Moscow made, which was very strongly opposed to this program for regional development. And indeed, when you think about Russia's strategies for kickstarting the economy, there's been a lot more thinking about how to throw money at the region rather than what kind of structural reforms do you need to make to actually make it into a more attractive focus for foreign investment. The recognition that you need foreign investment is there. There's less, I think, understanding about what kind of conditions you need to create in order to make that foreign investment possible. And this is where the question of Russia's relationship with China becomes salient. China obviously has a lot of money available for foreign investment. It's made significant investments in a number of post-Soviet countries. In fact, it's really driving the reconnection of Eurasia by building roads and railroads through Central Asia in particular, and could easily do the same thing in Siberia and the Far East, and on some level has. The loans for pipelines, for example, being an example of this. The concern, though, is that this only reinforces this sort of neo-colonial economic relationship that many Russians are concerned is developing between their country and China. And so you hear more and more people talk about diversifying the sources of foreign investment into the Far East, seeking trade and investment deals from other Asian partners, whether that's Japan, whether that's India, whether that's even some of the Southeast Asian countries, in addition, of course, in the long term, to the United States. And there are many Russians, including those in the Far East, who would dearly love to have U.S. FDI coming into the Russian Far East to drive its reconnection with the rest of the country and to drive regional economic development. Is really bolstering economic development in the Russian Far East and strengthening the ties between that region and the center of Russia, then you can't be overly dependent on China. And that recognition is becoming more and more pronounced in the official discourse in Russia. And so that is one way, one potential opportunity for deepening cooperation with a number of other regional powers and potentially with the United States. The second area of tension that I want to talk about between Moscow and Beijing in Asia has to do with regional security. So Russia, of course, sees itself as a global power. This has been one of the great challenges that it's had since the Soviet Union collapsed, because certainly Russia today doesn't punch the same weight that it did before 1991, and yet by virtue of its nuclear arsenal and its seat on the UN Security Council, among others, continues to regard itself as a power of the first rate. And of course, that includes in Asia. Russia wants to see itself as an independent security actor in East and South Asia. And, its interests in these regions are driven not only by a kind of great power nostalgia, but also by a series of concrete interests, some of them inherited from the Soviet Union, but not all of them. There's a problem with all of this, though, which is that because of the limited economic presence that Russia as an important player, to give it a seat at the table. They're concerned both that Russia is a relative lightweight in economic as well as security terms, and that it's more likely to be a pawn of Beijing than an independent actor on its own. And so for that reason, there's a lot of reluctance to get too deeply enmeshed with the Russians, whether you're talking about some of the Southeast Asian countries or some of the Northeast Asian countries. Now, of course, Russia is pushing to expand its ties throughout both Northeast and Southeast Asia, partially to limit the impact of the Sinocentrism that has existed up to this point of its pivot to Asia. The list I would put arms sales. Russia is a major supplier of weapons to a number of Asian states, including India, Vietnam. It's pushing for deals in places like Indonesia and Malaysia as well. And what's interesting about this, of course, is many of these states have, shall we say, complicated relationships with China. This is particularly true of India and Vietnam. Both countries of which, by the way, had close relations with the Soviet Union. And there have been a number of instances where Chinese officials have asked the Russians to, for example, curtail the type and level of their weapon sales to the Vietnamese, and the Russians have made it clear that they have no intention of doing that. Recently, the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, was in Hanoi, held consultations with his Vietnamese counterpart, and among other issues discussed was the possibility more to be in an advisory or technical capacity, Russian technicians rather than Russian warships. But nevertheless, this is surely a development, given Vietnam's difficulties with China, that's sure to raise a certain degree of wariness in Beijing. At the same time, and I think this is another area that doesn't get remarked on enough, Russia's major export from the Far East is, of course, raw materials. Some of these go to Japan, some of these go to global markets. But when they're exported by ship from the Far East, a large percentage of them go through the East China Sea. And for that reason, Russia has an interest in maintaining freedom of navigation through the East China Sea, not seeing this become a cockpit for conflict between Japan and China. Obviously, Russia's relationship with Japan is not particularly good because of the territorial dispute over the islands, but nevertheless, Russia is wary of China's claims to the disputed islands and to control maritime routes throughout the East China Sea, as well as the development of a more powerful Chinese Navy. In fact, Russia is boosting it the size of its own Pacific fleet. The reasons for this have been debated. Sometimes Russian analysts will talk to deploy these two Mistral helicopter carriers that it was buying from the French to the Pacific Fleet in order to secure its control over the disputed islands. Talking to people from the Russian military, in fact, you hear a lot of people say, not for attribution, that the concern is much more with the development of the Chinese Navy than with the potential for conflict over the islands with Japan. One of the previous presenters mentioned how, for a lot of people in the Russian military, China is sort of the threat that dare not speak its name. And I think that's absolutely true. It's true particularly, it's true both on land and at sea. And so for this reason, there's a significant divergence of interest between Moscow and Beijing when it comes to regional security. And once again, I think this offers an opportunity for creative thinking in the United States about how to engage Russia as a potential power in Asia. The third area of, I won't say conflict, but at least divergence between Russia and China in the region is in Central Asia. We heard a lot about this during the first panel, and I don't want to go over ground that's already been covered, but let me just make a couple of brief remarks here. During the Soviet period, of course, Central Asia was closed off from its historic linkages to the outside world. Of course, we know that for a long time, Central Asia was a key transit route during the existence of the Silk Road. That collapsed before the Soviet Union developed, but then once the Soviet borders were closed, even less did Central Asia become connected to the outside world. It became one of the most isolated parts of the world, in fact. And it was only when the Soviet Union collapsed that some of these historic connections began to be put back together. Connections to South Asia and increasingly to East Asia as well. And in fact, it's happened quite quickly. Central Asia has once again developed economic and more gradually political connections to East Asia, specifically to China. However, given Russian thinking about Central Asia as a key buffer zone against instability further to the south, and as an area where, because of the Soviet legacy, Moscow should have a leading political and security role, this is obviously a source of tension with Beijing as well. Given the much greater political dynamism, or economic dynamism, of China relative to Russia, China has rapidly become the main economic partner for many of the Central Asian states. In fact, now China's trade volume with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan is greater than Russia's, and it's close with Uzbekistan. Chinese investment in Central Asia is growing quite rapidly, especially in energy, but also in infrastructure. And this is important because infrastructure, pipelines, railroads, roads, and the like, change the long-term patterns of economic interaction. And so over the course of many years, this lays the foundation, I think, for a gradual reorientation of trade patterns of economies and ultimately for political influence in the region more towards China, largely at Russia's expense, since Russia is, in this region, the status quo power. In terms of the multilateral institutions that Bradley Merck talked about before, that was a really fascinating presentation that he gave. And I especially liked his point about how the customs union, Eurosec, has made Russia more confident and therefore allowed it to be more sanguine about the strengthening of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's really a kind of a new development, and one I think that it's very important to bear watching. What's interesting, though, is how Russia's push for multilateral integration in the region has largely been driven by political considerations to a much greater degree, I think, than economic. And this is true even of something like the customs union. The customs union's biggest impact on the ground really seems to be on trading relationships between certainly Kazakhstan, which is already a member, and potentially Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan on their trading relationships with China. And for that reason, there are a lot of business people, shuttle traders, but also people in retail, manufacturing, and elsewhere, who are very concerned about the potential for the customs union to undermine their full economic model. Now, of course, there will be winners as well as losers if this comes to pass, and whether it will be on aggregate good or bad for the economies of these countries, I'll be agnostic about. But certainly there will be losers, and these losers are very, very concerned. Just recently, the Kazakh opposition put forward a proposal for Kazakhstan to leave the customs union. Of course, this was coming from the opposition, and so it's not kind of, in any sense, official policy. Yet there's a lot of speculation in the press that this move was at least tacitly blessed by people in Nazarbayev's administration because of frustration, because of concern about what integration with the customs union was doing to Kazakhstan's economy, specifically the requirement that it raise its external customs frontiers, limiting its ability to trade with outside partners, specifically China. There's also the CSTO, the Cooperative Security Treaty, or Collective Security Treaty Organization, which from Russia's perspective is especially important because it gives member states veto rights over the deployment of foreign troops within the region. So assuming that this agreement holds, this actually provides Russia with a tool to block the deployment of U.S. forces in the region post-2014. And obviously we know that Russia has put a lot of pressure on the Kyrgyz government to close the Manas Transit Center to U.S. forces once the withdrawal from Afghanistan is complete. But at the same time, what we're seeing, I think, with the CSTO relative to the SCO is that the security basket is becoming much more developed within the CSTO, and the SCO is concentrating more and more on issues of economic development. And so again, this is this is something that I think is being driven especially by Russia. So what you're seeing is a way to try and sort of limit the potential for a long-term assertion of Chinese political and security influence in Central Asia. Now, for now, this hasn't been a major source of tension because China seems largely content to keep its interests in the region limited to economic issues. However, one of the panelists talked before about the potential for cross-border intervention if there's a crisis in Xinjiang. It seems to have external support from groups in Central Asia. what would Russia do under such a scenario? It's an interesting question, one that I think we should probably think. Okay, so it's clear that the Sino-Russian relationship is deepening. It's fueled by economic complementarity. The fact that Russia is a major energy producer, China is a major energy consumer that's looking to diversify its sources of oil, gas, coal, and other kinds of natural resources, as well as a shared concern about U.S. power, about the United States throwing its weight around internationally outside the framework of the UN Security Council. Yet, for the reasons that I laid out, this relationship remains wary. It's subject to reversals, even as Russia seeks to become a bigger player in Asia, not only because of its global concerns about the United States, but increasingly because of its concerns about the underdevelopment of the Russian Far East. And so, as Russia seeks gradually and with the expected reversals to become a bigger presence in Asia, how the U.S. manages its own Asia pivot is going to go some way towards determining how the future relationship between Beijing and Moscow develops. And so here I would say there are really two big questions. One is, what is the ultimate aim of the U.S. pivot strategy? Is it to contain China or to integrate it? And in fact, the signals so far have been a little bit mixed. I think the preponderance of evidence, certainly from this administration, has been that the emphasis on integrating China. It's on developing a set of rules that will shape the way that China interacts both bilaterally and multilaterally in the Asia-Pacific for years and years to come. At the same time, there's been some public messaging, for example, around the deployment of Marines to Australia, that seems to emphasize the military aspect of this pivot. There's concern in China about the development of the security relationship between the United States and India, about the potential response of South Korea to the provocations coming from the north. What if South Korea decides that it wants to develop nuclear weapons, or at least some kind of more effective military capability to deal with these kind of provocations? What does this mean for China's security over the longer term? And then, in terms of these issues connected with multilateralism and multilateral institutions, how does the U.S. manage its regional allies and partners? Does it seek to take advantage of the discontent of countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, India, and others who have territorial disputes with China to build them into a balancing coalition against China? Or does the U.S. seek to promote multilateralism and reconciliation, rules for resolving some of these disputes in a peaceful, multilateral, diplomatic way? And here, I would say the U.S. has done a relatively good job so far. It has insisted that it's not going to take sides in the territorial disputes between Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, China, and others. It's pushing for a code of conduct. It's pushing for negotiations to address these concerns. And in terms of building new institutions, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the East Asian Summit, seeking to make sure that China remains a central player in this. Obviously, the TPP is, China is not a part of that now, but certainly, if you talk to people who are thinking and theorizing about where this is going to go over the longer term, it's very much predicated on the idea that it's going to establish a set of rules that ultimately will encourage or force China to adhere to it on the basis of principles elaborated primarily by the United States and its liberal allies. The second big question, of course, is where does Russia fit into all of this? Where does Russia fit into the U.S. pivot strategy? As I've said, so far Russia seems largely absent in U.S. discussions of the pivot, partially because of Russia's own ambivalence about Asia, but also, I'd say, because of past dependence, because U.S.-Russian relations historically have focused much more on Europe and more recently the former Soviet Union, and there's just not the same institutionalization of U.S.-Russian relations, U.S.-Russian cooperation in Asia that there is in other parts of the world. Of course, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The polarization that characterizes U.S.-Russian interactions in Europe, or even in the post-Soviet space, is not nearly as pronounced in Asia. Certainly the legacy of the Cold War in the region is different. Russia never regarded the U.S.-South Korean or the U.S.-Japanese alliance as nearly as threatening to its own interests as it regarded NATO, for example. In fact, Russia is quite glad that the U.S. had this security alliance with Seoul and Japan Japan, and with Seoul and Tokyo, precisely because it meant that those countries weren't going to develop nuclear weapons and were going to build up their own militaries in ways that could become threatening to Russia itself. So I would argue that this actually creates a more benign environment for thinking about broader U.S.-Russian cooperation in Asia. Some of the legacies and pathologies of the Cold War that continue to freight that relationship in Europe and in the former Soviet Union don't exist, certainly not to the same degree in Asia. At the same time, the U.S. would do well, I think, to have a more active Russia in Asia. There is a shared interest, for example, in institutionalizing multilateral security cooperation. Here, for those who are interested, I would direct you to the writings of former Russian Deputy Foreign Minister for Asia, Alexei Borodovkin. He's kind of an interesting fellow because he was the Russian ambassador to the OSCE before he became Deputy Foreign Minister in charge of Asia. And I've heard a number of people point out that his time at the OSCE really shaped his thinking about the multilateral security environment in Asia. The fact that you don't have anything like the OSCE is one of the reasons that Asia is one of the reasons that an under-institutionalized Asia remains more of a fracture zone, where it's more likely that you're going to have major clashes between states than you are in the Eurasian space, where you have these more effective multilateral organizations. And so Russia has been pushing for greater institutionalization of security cooperation in Asia, something that the United States itself has been pushing for as well, specifically in the context of the East Asia Summit, which the United States joined in 2010, incidentally at the same time that Russia joined. Also, Russia, I think, has been punching significantly below its weight on a number of issues of regional security where the U.S. would benefit from having a Russia that's more engaged. And here we could just talk about the perpetual crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Russia is a member of the six-party talks designed to deal with the North Korean nuclear challenge, but has not really been a significant contributor to those talks in any way. Nevertheless, Russia shares a border with North Korea. It, along with China, is one of the few countries that has a relatively positive functional relationship with Pyongyang. And in fact, there are a significant number of North Korean labor working in Russia. Former North Korean President Kim Jong-il visited Russia on a couple of occasions. According to the Russians, he was actually born in Russia. But according to the North Koreans, of course, he was born on a sacred mountain in Korea. Nevertheless, I think this is an area, along with this issue of freedom of navigation in the East China Sea, and more broadly, where long-term U.S. and Russian interests generally tend to coincide. And because of this legacy of confrontation that exists in Europe and the post-Soviet region is less pronounced, I think makes it more possible to think about Asia as a kind of pilot region, a laboratory for thinking about more extensive U.S.-Russian security cooperation. The danger, I think, is that if the U.S. gets its relationship with Russia wrong, not because of what's happening in Asia, but because of what's happening in the post-Soviet space, because of issues like missile defense or the nuclear strategic balance issues, then this potential for cooperation in Asia is going to be a victim of all of that. And if it becomes a victim, what you're going to see, I think, is a deeper strategic alignment between Moscow and Beijing in a way that strives even more than it has up until now to limit the applicability of U.S. power, not only at the UN Security Council, but in Asia as well. And I think that would undermine not only the prospects for the U.S. pivot to Asia, but I think also the chances for long-term economic growth and stability within Asia itself, which is, after all, the reason that the U.S. is interested in pivoting to the region in the first place. Okay, thank you. And I don't know, Maria, do we have time for questions?
5 minutes or so. If you can please keep the comment questions short.
Right. You mentioned the Russian interest in diversifying the source of foreign investment. Japan has been interested in that for a long time. Why don't the Russians settle their territorial dispute with Japan? Because I think that would facilitate more investment from Japan.
I mean, the premise of your question is absolutely right. The problem as ever is politics. I think, and it's politics on both sides. It's not just the Russians. Two or one of the islands could revert back to Japanese control. control. There could be some kind of agreement on how do you exploit the resources there, only to find that either the Japanese were not willing to engage or that whatever supposedly Tokyo promised they then reneged on. And that, I think, has built up a lot of mistrust. On the Russian side, recently there's been a kind of desire to sort of be more provocative. So, Medvedev visited the islands. This talk about deploying the Mistral helicopter carriers, even if it really is about China, the public messaging is that it's about Japan and it's about the islands. So that makes it hard. But I think there are real problems on the Japanese side too. You've had a series of weak governments in Tokyo going back several years now. This is obviously a very sensitive issue in Japan. And when you have weak governments, I think that makes it more difficult to countenance territorial concessions. So, until or unless you have I think then, you're in a position where you can think about, really having some kind of an agreement here. And then, of course, that would depend on whether the Russians are willing to engage again at that point as well. But the premise that resolving this dispute as a way to open up Japanese investment in the Far East is critical. There's one other thing I would add, though, and that is that the lack of Japanese investment in the Far East is only partially about the territorial dispute. It's partially about some of these bigger issues related to governance, and the fact that Russia is just not a very attractive place to do business. There were some Japanese companies that were involved in and that really soured not only them, but a lot of Japanese industrialists on doing business in Russia. And so until or unless Moscow does more on judicial independence, rule of law, dealing with the phenomenon of reyderstva, it's going to be an uphill climb, whatever happens on the territorial issue.
Dr. Mankoff, I have a quick question. On how would you gauge the impact of the opening of the Arctic on, frankly, any of these thoughts and theses? Is it something, or is it just another thing?
Well, so, in a project I'm working on now, I make the point that the opening of the Arctic, which is still partial and it's a ways off from being sort of a viable transit route, but it gives the Russians a further interest in this idea of freedom of navigation. The U.S. has been proposing this code of conduct on the South China Sea, for example, which codifies principles about freedom of navigation, and has been pushing it like the East Asia Summit. And the Russians have been nowhere to be found on this issue. And, frankly, they have no reason to be. They're not a literal state on the South China Sea. But they do have an interest in the East China Sea, and especially with the opening of transit across the Arctic, they so in the longer term, I think that's something that may incline Moscow to be a little bit more forward-leaning on some of these issues, even if it's not going to engage specifically on the question of the South China Sea.
Sort from our online audience, we have Frank Dowes from the Naval Special Warfare Command. Given the sale of a Soviet-era Kiev-class AC carrier to China and the perceived concerns of Russia for a rise in potential Chinese blue water power projection in the Pacific Yellow Sea, Malacca Strait Zone, how do we interpret the apparent schizophrenia of Russian arms sales and Russian geostrategic regional naval concerns?
Mm-hmm. I would like to punt that back to the previous panel, because I think they would be able to give our questioner a more thorough answer. I would just sort of say, schizophrenia is a good way to describe it. So is mercantilism. Go ahead and sell it. There is a lobby within the military that's very concerned about how these sales to China affect the overall strategic balance. And I was talking before about how arms sales to China plummeted during the mid-2000s. And that was when you really heard these voices becoming louder about how, by giving Beijing access to the top flight equipment that we were producing, we were essentially, I think Lenin came up with the term, we'll sell the capitalists the rope that they use to hang themselves. And I think that concern was becoming more and more pronounced. So it's still there, but at the same time, there are mercantilist concerns. You have to, as one of the previous panelists said, the military-industrial complex needs the money to develop the next generation of systems, and the Chinese pay cash.